But there are still so many cool features of SynthEyes that we didn't cover yet, so maybe we do have time for one last example. And for that I want to quickly hide SynthEyes and go to my web browser, and there go to a site named hollywoodcamerawork.us. Because here you can go to downloads and then tracking plates. And the cool thing is that hollywoodcamerawork.us gives you some free tracking footage that you can use for training and practicing. And I want to use the Blasterwalk HD plate, because that allows us to practice object tracking in SynthEyes. Because you can not only track your camera, you can also at the same time track an object that moves in the scene. And in this example, we have that woman carrying that proxy object, and later in compositing in your 3D application you could exchange that maybe for some plasma gun or some BFG or any object that you want. So you can download that and then go back to SynthEyes, and of course I've already done that. So let me come here, hit Command O and go to that folder, Blasterwalk, and open that. And on the website they said it has been shot in 30 FPS, so instead of using that NTSC preset, let's just go ahead and set this to 30 frames per second. And if you have a look at the images here, you can see this is squashed. So we have to apply a preset here, and this is an HD plate, so we can just use that HD preset, and that is 1.777. You can see that has also adjusted the pixel aspect ratio. So let's just click OK. And that looks much better than before. And maybe we can set this to normal speed instead of frame by frame. And then playback. So you see we have a very smooth camera. That shouldn't be too hard to track. And then we have this object here with all these red balls. And we have to track these and then calculate a coordinate system for both the scene and also the object. I want to use auto tracking for the camera solution, but I want to do supervised tracking for that object. And let's just start with the auto track for the camera solution. And before we can do that, we have to deal with that person walking in our shot, because if you would just hit auto now, SynthEyes would also track these features, also that person here. So we have to deal with that, and you can do that very easily just by creating a rotospline. But we already have a spline here, and that is the camera spline. And that means that SynthEyes will perform the tracking within that spline. We have here these red dots defining that rectangle. And if you move these dots, you can change the area within that SynthEyes will perform the tracking. So you could exclude this area if you wanted to. But we want to get rid of that person, so we can create a new spline. Click here, and if you click and drag, you can create that rectangle, and by default this will be set to garbage. So that means that SynthEyes will not track in that area. Now, because we don't want to change the camera spline, I want to hide it, because I don't want to accidentally grab this control point for the camera and then move that. So we can click here and then disable the show spline setting. Alright, now of course we have to animate that throughout the shot, and we can do that very easily just by going through the shot and animating these control points. So you have this point in the center to grab that and move that around. Then you have the scale and rotation point here on the side. And of course you have these control points in the corners. Now the default setting is just the points that you are moving will be keyframed. but you can change that if you want to by enabling this setting, key all control points, if any, so that as soon as you do one adjustment to one of these control points, you will have a keyframe for all of these. So I like this setting much more than without, because I think this helps to avoid surprises. Okay, so this was very easy, as you can see, because she's basically just always in the center of the frame, so we don't have to animate that much. Alright, and now that we have done that, we can go ahead and click on that auto button and just perform the automatic track. And that should be very fast, because we have a very smooth camera movement. So we are already done in almost 2 seconds. And if you look at that arrow value, that is not too bad either. Maybe let's clean up some more of these trackers by hitting Shift-C. Fix bad frames. Maybe reduce the threshold. Fix. Solve again. Alright, 0.5, that is already a very good arrow value. Maybe let's have a look at the graphs editor real quickly. Command A, then switch to graphs mode. And you can see we have these blue lines, and they are basically just the arrow value for these trackers, and you can select them with the isolate tool. And if you want to, you can just get rid of that tracker. Let's zoom in here a bit. And you can see it looks very good, although there's a little bit of jitter, just a little bit. But looking at that camera, I don't think the camera has been shaking at all, because this has been shot with a Steadicam. It was very smooth, so all the jitter that we have here is probably just due to compression artifacts, grain, or maybe because we have some real tiny features here. So what we can do about that is, let me quickly go back to camera, is to perform the fine-tuning of trackers. You can find the fine-tune trackers menu up here in the track menu, then go here, fine-tune trackers, and that will bring up a menu. And let me also go here back to our tracker panel and then compare these two settings. We have that key spacing that is basically the same as this one. Because what will happen is, if you run the fine-tune trackers menu, then SynthEyes will take all your automatic trackers and recalculate them using the algorithms for supervised trackers. And these algorithms are a little bit more complicated and superior to the more simplistic algorithms of the automatic tracking. And in some cases, that can really help you to improve the quality of your tracking, especially when you have a rather smooth camera movement, but maybe noisy footage with camera grain or compression artifacts and stuff like that. So you have that key spacing setting here, and that basically just means that there will be one keyframe every 8 frames instead of a keyframe on every frame, like you do have when you select one of these automatic trackers. You can see there's a keyframe on every frame, and that can also be a reason for more noise in your tracker curves. So let's hit run, and that can take a while, because now SynthEyes has to go through all of your automatic trackers, and that is usually quite a lot of trackers, so that can really take a while. And it doesn't necessarily improve your solution, because also the supervised tracking algorithms can make mistakes. Trackers can jump off and start tracking a different feature. That can always happen, but it is always worth a try if the fine-tuned trackers can improve your solution. So after you've done that, of course, you have to resolve the scene. And in fact, it didn't improve our error value, so we have a problem. But if we now go ahead and hit Shift-C and clean up these problematic high error trackers, then I'm pretty sure that we have a much better value now. Okay, now we are below 0.5, so that's already pretty good. And if you have a look at the graphs now, some of them are now more smooth and not so shaky anymore. Sometimes that can really help you to improve your solution. Let me quickly do another one last error fix. Go. Okay, 0.4, that's great. I mean, we can improve that solution even more if we would now calculate the lens distortion, but I don't want to perform the lens workflow, and I also don't think it's necessary for this shot, because the only area that will be interesting later in compositing in 3D will be this center of the frame to replace that object, and for that I'm sure that the camera solution is good enough. So let's go ahead and set up the coordinate system. So go here and then select our 3-point picker, then select the origin. That maybe could be here. But now instead of picking, for example, this point as the left-right point, I want to see if we can get a little bit more in line with our grid by selecting not the left-right point, but the front-back point. So if you click on that button again, this will switch from left-right to front-back. So the next tracker that you will select here will now be the front-back point, or let's say it's not the x-axis, now that is the y-axis, and the last point that you will be picking now is still the plane point. So maybe for that we could use this one, apply, and you can see we are pretty much in line with our scene. In fact, that is really good. I mean, this is almost parallel to the y-axis. So in some cases it's just better to use the front-back point instead of the left-right point. But now we also have to set up a size constraint, because if you want to insert that 3D object tracking later inside that camera path, then Synthesize has to know the relations of the sizes of that object to that scene. So let's just go ahead and set up the size for our camera solution. So I switch to constraint points, then select that, and now we could just guess the distance between these points, or maybe we can use that one. I think this is a little bit more easier to guess what the distance between these points is. So I want to go ahead and switch here from constraint point to 20 to just on y-axis, and I hope this works. Okay, then now we can select this point here, hold down the command key, or on Windows probably the control key, and then select this point. Now this will be the constraint to that point, and we can set up the distance. And now I really have to guess again, because I don't know that much about cars. How is the width of a car? Maybe 1 meter and 8? 2 meters? I really have no idea. So let's just try that. Hit Shift G to recalculate. And that seemed to have worked. So I think we have just finished the camera solution, and I think we can now go ahead and start tracking that object. So when we now want to track an object, we first have to tell Synthesize that there is a new object, and you can do that by going to Shot and then Add a Moving Object. And if you now look up here, you can see this has changed from Camera 1 to Object 1. Camera, all these trackers are green and yellow, and then to object, and now these trackers have a different color, and that just tells you that you now are dealing with a different object and new trackers. Alright, so now let me go full screen and start tracking. Now there are two different ways that we could deal with that, and let's start with the second one, and I will use that later, and that is supervised tracking, because I know already from several tests that in this case it's much easier and faster to do supervised tracking than to try auto tracking. but maybe for some other shots it might be easier and faster to use automatic tracking for that object. So let me show you that first, because there's a very nifty way in tracking this object with automatic tracking. So let's come here back to our roto panel, and first of all I want to hide this mask for that person. So click on show the spline, and I also want to disable the key all control points if any setting. Okay, so now we have to create a new mask. So click on that creation tool and click and drag to create that mask for this object. Maybe you can also rotate already. And if you now go through the shot, you can see you do have to animate quite a bit if you really want to mask out the surrounding area. Oh, and speaking of which, of course, we have to change that from garbage to object 1, because we want to include this area and we want to exclude the surrounding area. Alright, and now to make things easier, you can use a tracker to control the position of that roto spline. So let me show you that, and first we have to create a tracker. So maybe let's use this one and track that through the whole shot. Okay, so now we have that tracker tracking that green ball. We can lock that, and now let's also give it a name. So we can change that here from tracker 121 to maybe roto track, because now if you go back to the roto spline panel, you can click on import tracker to control point, and if you click that, it has turned to blue, just like your 3D point picker for origin, plane point and axis point. So now we can click on that tracker, select that, and after that we can now activate the center point for the spline or the spline origin, and you can see what happened. Now this control point will be controlled by that tracker. So now we can excuse me, we have to disable that first. So we can now adjust these surrounding control points. There are some areas that we could improve. Maybe here with that scale and rotation point, like this. So, well, that just makes life easier because we don't have to animate the origin of that roto spline. So that is very cool. And of course you can do multiple tracks. You could track 2 or 3 points more and control these control points. But I mean, then you could just do supervised tracking right from the beginning. Okay, so now let's go ahead and calculate the blips for this area, blips all frames, although there will be blips throughout the whole frame. But now I want to peel all, and now there will be just peeled inside that area. So just clear all the blips right away. But you can see there are also some blips, some features here on the floor, and you would have to delete them manually, and that happens through the whole shot. So in this case, you know, it's really easier to do supervised tracking. So let me undo that and also just delete that spline here and then do supervised tracking instead. Alright, now we already have this tracker here, and I'm pretty sure we can use it for tracking later. It's not that bad. but we obviously need more than this. So I want to maybe create a tracker here on that red ball. But if I now just hit spacebar to start tracking, then it will suddenly jump off its original position, because here where it has jumped off, the hand is a very similar color as that red ball. So there it will just be confused and start tracking a different area, and I have to correct that. Now the easiest way, of course, is to just insert a keyframe here by clicking on Now, and then go a few frames forward, go back and correct that again, and so on. But sometimes it is easier and quicker to just use automatic keyframes, and you might remember that key spacing number that we had on the fine-tuned trackers, and we can do the same thing here. So if you insert a number of 8 here and then start tracking, you can see it will automatically insert keyframes, and sometimes these auto keys can help the tracker to stay in the right position. In this case, this didn't work. So we now have to go back and correct these manually. Maybe let's insert a keyframe here, go back until we reach that next keyframe. And the problem is with these auto keyframes that if you just hit spacebar and let the tracker do its thing, then it will probably, if it jumps off and will continue tracking, then you will have these keyframes, and if you correct them here in the middle of the shot, maybe insert a keyframe here, then you have that keyframe on frame 33, and now even though you had that keyframe on frame 32, it still jumps off, and that is because you have that keyframe on frame 33. So to get rid of that, you can just delete that keyframe by clicking on Now, and that will delete the keyframe and will place the tracker back where it should be, considering where it has been on frame 32. Now you can correct that and then continue on tracking, and boom, we have the same problem again. So kill that keyframe and then continue. So while in this case this is not a really big problem, sometimes it can get really annoying. And to prevent that, you can, and let me please go and hit undo. So in some cases you might want to go to track and then enable stop on auto key, because now if you, for example, insert a key spacing of 10 and hit spacebar to start tracking, it will stop on frame 10 and will let you do corrections. So in case like here where it jumps off, you can go back and adjust that, and you don't have too much keyframes, you just in this case have one that you have to correct. So that might be a way to avoid this annoying automatic keyframes if you're using them. But still there's one more thing that you could do, and that is not only enable stop on auto key, but also pre-roll by key smooth. So you have this key smooth setting here, and you can maybe set this to, let's say, 5, and then go ahead and start tracking, and you correct the keyframe, come back here and then hit spacebar again. It will start 5 frames in the past and then goes over your keyframe and starts tracking in the future. So that way it tries to accommodate to the change that you did to the tracker. I'm not sure if this explanation has been particularly good, but maybe you can understand it anyway. So if you hit spacebar now, it will track 10 frames and then it will stop. And if you now hit spacebar again, it will go 5 frames back and then continues to track 15 frames. So that way you can, if you do an adjustment, let's say here on frame 81, it will not only continue here on frame 82, so that way you would have that jump between frame 81 and 82. No, it would go back to frame 75 and then do a smooth transition between the placement of the tracker on frame 82 and 81. So that way you can make sure that you have a smoother transition of keyframes if you have to do some adjustments. And sometimes that is very helpful, but to be honest, I'm not using that very often. I rather prefer doing manual keyframes instead of these automatic keyframes, because I find it much easier to hit stop or spacebar to stop the tracking, correct that keyframe, then continue without having to deal with already wrong keyframes that I might have in the future. Alright, so still we have to delete them. So, I mean, you could just have done it manually right from the beginning. And now this tracker is finished. Okay, so we do have some jitter here that is just caused by some problems within the tracking, but the rest looks pretty fine to me. But because of that jitter, I don't want to just lock the keyframe by pressing that button here. No, instead I want to use the Finalize Tracker button, and that will bring up a menu, and that lets you filter the frames. And the default setting is the filter frames of 7, and that will smooth out the tracker curve with a filter frame setting of 7. And if you hit OK now, and then look at the tracker, you can see that now it looks much worse. And that is because the filter frame setting has been too high. And therefore it had also filtered the actual movement that we had in the shot, instead of just filtering out that jitter around frame 185. So let's undo that and instead finalize the tracker with a filter frame setting of 2. And I really prefer rather low filter frame settings, because that way you can filter out compression artifacts or jitter because of film grain or stuff like that, but you will not filter out the actual movement of camera or an object. And maybe also reduce the filter strength. Alright, so here it still is pretty fine, but the jitter on these frames is almost gone. So that can really help you to get smoother and better supervised trackers. So maybe let's just continue on tracking, maybe with this green ball back there. And I also don't want to use any automatic keyframes, because I really prefer to do it manually. So it's spacebar and wait until it jumps off. And it will probably be somewhere around frame 40 or 50, because here that green ball will be hidden by that object and that red ball. So here it jumps off. So maybe we can do some manual keyframes, like for example here, here, there. And of course we could just guess where that green ball is here in these frames, but let's just turn it off. Filter or finalize. That looks good to me. And then come back here to these frames where that green ball is visible again. And then continue on tracking. Maybe insert some keyframes here, just to make sure that it doesn't jump off. And then we have to pay attention, because now it will be hidden again by that red ball. Okay, maybe until now, then turn it off, finalize, and then combine that with the tracker in these frames. So just shift select it and then hit shift 7 to combine these trackers. Alright. And of course we still need a few more of these trackers, so let's just quickly do that. Drag that. And also finalize it. And the reason that we didn't use the finalize trackers option in the other shots was just that these shots were really shaky handheld shots and I didn't want to filter out any camera movement. But if you have a really smooth shot like this one, then filtering is always a good idea. But let me just quickly finish all these trackers here, and that is probably rather boring, so I will just pause the screencast and then come back again when I have finished tracking all these features. Okay, so now I have finished most of these trackers, and I would also say most of them are pretty good tracks, but one of them is maybe not quite as good. So let's have a look at this one. It's not really bad, but it's also wandering around that also rather big red ball. So it's not tracking a small position, but a rather big, and it's not particularly precise. Alright, so now I have finished tracking most of these features, so we can now go ahead and start solving the object movement. But before we have to set up the coordinates for that object, so let's come here to the coordinate system panel and then enable the 3-point picker. Select the origin, which maybe could be that one here. Then I also don't want to use the left-right point, but I want to select the front-back point. So just click here, change that mode from left-right to front-back, and then use this tracker here. And the next point will be the plane point, and that of course could be any of these trackers here on the side. So maybe let's just use that one here, apply that, and before we start solving I want to set up the size constraint, and I do that by going to constraint points, come here, select the front back point, and I would say this is probably something around 1 meter. So let's come here and click and drag to set this to 1. And now we can start solving object and camera simultaneously. So to do that, come back to the camera, set the solving mode to automatic, and then you just start Go and let SynthEyes solve both the object and the camera at the same time. Alright, let's go to quad view. And now if you have a look at the path of camera and object, you can see that we probably did a pretty good job in setting up the size constraints, because if I look here at the position of that object, this is really near to the origin. If you remember, that was the origin for our camera solution, and this lady is walking just beside that origin. And if you zoom in here, the object is also moving very close to that origin. So we did a pretty good job, and we can now test our solution just by inserting a proxy object. And to do that, first you have to go back to the object, because I want to insert an object or a proxy object for our object track and not for the camera. So let's switch back to the object mode, and then come here to the 3D object. It's probably confusing always to say object, 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 but let's just come here and then insert a cylinder, maybe from top view or side view. I think side view would be better. So click and drag to the right size, and we still have to rotate that. Make it long enough, maybe like this. Go ahead and rotate here from the top view. Alright, then rotate from the side view until it matches these trackers here. and finally move it to the right position, and presto, she's wearing a very beautiful red cylinder. So let's look at that from full screen. It's spacebar and maybe also J and Control J to hide the trackers and the 3D points. Spacebar. And there she's carrying our beautiful, beautiful red cylinder. So that's object tracking in SynthEyes. And of course, if you export that now to your 3D application, you can replace that cylinder by, I don't know, a plasma gun, a rocket launcher, you know, whatever. And I couldn't help but try that immediately, so I've exported that, then went right into Blender and then put together a crappy rocket launcher. And I quickly want to show you that. So that's how it looks like in Blender. You can see we have our cylinder here, the camera dancing around in 3D space. I probably should have just exported a few of these trackers, so now we have quite a mess here. But I've put them on a different layer so we can quickly hide that. Then here's my crappy rocket launcher. And this is how it looks like from camera view. It's really a crappy rocket launcher, but you know, this was just a quickie, just to see how it looks like. Maybe we can calculate the motion path here. So here's that rocket launcher in 3D space. And then I've got my compositing set up here. And I want to show you the finished and rendered result. So let me quickly hide Blender. That's how it looks like. Ridiculous rocket launcher, but the point is, from the tracking point of view, I would say it's fairly good. I mean, she's really holding that in her hands. There are no sudden movements, no spikes in the animation path, so I think it's fairly good. And that also concludes our SynthEyes tracking tutorial. And I hope you could get some useful information out of that. And if this has been too long, if I've been talking too much, if this was boring, then sorry for that. But well, I thought maybe let's do it slowly and step by step so that everybody can follow through these different examples of different workflows for different scenes in SynthEyes. Now, of course, I didn't cover everything. That would just have taken too long. But please go ahead and read the manual, because SynthEyes has really an exceptionally good manual. And also there are a lot of great tutorials on the SynthEyes website, so please go ahead and check them out. But of course, all these tutorials that you find there are more specific tutorials for specific features, so they don't cover a whole workflow from A to Z, but for some specific features they are really, really good. Alright, and now I think all that's left for me to say is thanks for watching, and if you are interested in compositing with Blender, then please go ahead and check out my next tutorial that will cover compositing and rendering with Blender. So thanks for watching and goodbye.